I am taking this year, as you saw, 57 to 61. Okay. Now I realize it's a very long period of time. I was already criticized for covering too much of a period. But the truth is that in the historical profession, periodization is something that's a matter of great debate. It's actually a rather intellectual topic. I mean, how do you identify specific periods in contradistinction to other? How do you make the argument for significance about certain eras? And as you see, I'm going to do this in a more or less four-year kind of basis. And the argument of this entire series, of course, of 14 talks, I hope, is that there is a specific set of phenomena and characteristics that make 57, the late 50s, so to speak, the early 60s, an identifiable and fascinating fascinating period in the history of the state of Israel. Good and bad, right? If you want only the good, go somewhere else. But if you want to see, as they say, as it was, because we all know Israel makes mistakes as well as it gets it right? And without any further ado, let's get into it. So 57, you'll recall, I'm just picking off where I left off last semester. Robert Feinberg is the registrar, so you have to clear with him. And at the end of 56, we saw a Sinai campaign, which started in the very end of October, November, December, January, February, March. That's the whole crisis. Israel invaded and occupied the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Desert October, November of 56, right during the second Eisenhower election, as you'll possibly recall. I see many faces from the past. And Eisenhower had forced them out by March of 57. That's the bottom line. The Israeli army has to pull out first they pull out of this, then they pull it out, but they finally did the last total pull out in March of 57. So that's where I'm picking up over here. The Sinai campaign, as you can sort of see over here, I had a audio to go along with this, but you'll satisfy yourself with the visual. Triumph, right? Oh boy, this is a triumph of Ben-Gurionist Israel. The army works, right? They beat the Arabs. That's the ultimate test of statehood. And there are a million of these kinds of, oh boy, Moshe Dayan was like a god, right? That we actually beat them. This is not long after the Holocaust. The helpless Jew. Now it looks different. This is made in South Africa, this particular thing for the South African Zionist League. They have things like this made all over the world. So the Jews get a thrill from Israel's actually victorious. You get it? This is one time the guys who want to beat us up got beat up. And the result is that it led to a feeling of tremendous validation, you might say, for the whole Ben-Gurionist system, okay? He created the army, he put it together, he got some things right, he got some things wrong, but Lamai said they won. On the other hand, the Sinai campaign also demonstrated the aftermath when Eisenhower kicked him out, right? Here again, I don't have the sound, but Golda Meir, Abba Iban, and the others, as you can see, the foreign minister and the ambassador to Washington have to go to the State Department, and they went back and forth and back, and the bottom line is out, okay? And so Ben-Gurion, in his unreality, had dreamed of conquering and annexing the Gaza Strip, certainly, and even if you look closely, even the Sinai Desert, he made a speech the day after they won the Sinai campaign, in which he started to say, Sharm el-Sheikh really is called this name in Hebrew, and Shlomo Melech owned it and all this kind of stuff, but reality then kicked in, okay? And that was the end of that. Plus, so my point is, they had a war, and it was for nothing. When I say for nothing, they didn't come back with any permanent gains. And also, you take a look, it cost them money, okay? Here's a speech Ben-Gurion is giving to Israelis, a special government loan of $22 million, meaning we want everybody to dig in the pocket and give us $22 million because he had to pay for the army. Now, by the way, boy, times have changed. Gas was a nickel, and a war cost $22 million. You understand? Now, gas is $3, and a war costs $1 trillion, doesn't it? So, this is really a speech over here. Now, by the way, this is not to the American Jews. This is the Israeli Jews. It's what they used to call forced loan. And under the Ben-Gurion system, they could do this. When I say forced loan, it means they went into your bank account. Okay, they had that power, and they would take, $10, $20, whatever it is, and that's what it is. But on the other hand, for an occasion like this, it's a special case. It's not stopped that they're stealing, that they did on other occasions. He says, but here really was a war, and everybody knew it cost money, had to pay for it. So, okay, this is what they call Ben-Gurionist Israel. the name of this series has been Gurion system at high noon. This is when a certain form of government, which is not there today exactly, but was it once upon a time, was in full swing, had its triumph and its peak period. That's what we'll be looking with the pluses and the minuses along there. And part of what they used to refer to this, a guy wrote a famous book in 1952, an Israeli professor, called the Totalitarian Democracy. And I've spoken about this in the past. It was democracy. You had a vote, right? There really were elections. There really were. And I would say, for the most part, they were as honest as the elections in Baltimore, you know? Okay, well, I'll say no more. But not more, not less, okay? But once the government was elected, they could, go into your bank account. In other words, there was a totalitarian kind of a system. So it was interesting in that particular regard. I wish I would have the audio for the next piece. I'll just have to slide over it. Although Israel was the one who attacked Egypt, but they were able to get away with it in the world opinion because the mid-50s was still the golden age of Zionist propaganda. And as you can see, I'll try later on to get this for you with the sound. They used to hire Drew Pearson, who was one of the big news hounds once upon a time, a famous name, and he was a Zionist propagandist for money. And so he went to Israel, and he's interviewing Ben Gurion over here. He said, I went to the great state of Israel and find out what's really happening with the Sinai campaign, and American people are wondering what's going on. And you'll see he has a long interview, which is already planned. I mean, this is not, it looks like a news thing, but it's really not a news thing. This is put by the United Jewish Appeal, And I'll just show you a second for a second. He's talking about how he wants to see what's happening in Israel. He's taking too long. But you'll see that he interviews Ben Gurion, and he said, why did Israel go into the Sinai campaign? And of course, Ben Gurion's already prepped. So he said, we went in for reason number one, reason number two, reason number three, the terrorist actions that are against us, and the what do you call it, the crossing of the borders, and the blockade, and Egypt violated the United Nations resolution because they wouldn't let Israeli ships through the Suez Canal, and all kinds of, he gave a whole big Ganza defense of Israel's position over here. This is Sde Boker, where Ben Gurion lived at that time, and the kibbutz in the desert, and there he is. And we can move on to the next item. Now, to get serious, the big result of the Sinai campaign was that Ben Gurion gave up his dream of Greater Israel. Until 56, Ben Gurion lived in a la-la land in which he said like this, will triumphs over facts. They never said that we could get Israel, and we did. They never said that Russia and America would recognize Israel, and we got it. And so even though Israel had lousy borders, we can annex and expand it. Now, you and I know he was wrong. Once I would say May of 48 was over, even by the time of June, what they have. And they certainly were not going to be able to expand into the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. But he thought they could. And a lot of the cross-border raiding that took place in the early 50s was against the background that Ben Gurion said, so we'll have a war, and then we had a war in 48, we got this, we'll have another war over here, we'll get that. But then he ran into reality. Even though he was allied with the British and the French, America and the others made him stop. And so this was a bucket of cold water. And he said, well, I guess the international system now is such that it's frozen. Israel has what it has. It's not going to be able to get any more. If anything, we have to make sure the Arabs don't take what we have, the little that we have. And so instead, starting in 57, in place of expansion, he initiated a policy of consolidation, okay? As he puts it, the ceaseless reinforcement of her position here in the land. And so that means that we have to bring in more immigrants and things like that. In the years 57, 61 that I'm talking about in this year, this semester, as they call it, are very much the Ben Gurion years. He was the prime minister, he was the boss, and he was able to concentrate in his hands an enormous amount of power such as he did not have beforehand. Perhaps you will recall from the past that in the earlier 50s, he had people who did not agree with his policies in the cabinet, most famously Moshe Sharet and others. He got rid of them by this time. Anybody who's left in the cabinet, Mapai Party, are people who are yes men. at least in the area of foreign policy and defense and security, which is the only thing he cared about. Economics and all he didn't understand, and he never claimed he did. He left that to others. But when it comes to areas of building up Israel's defenses and dealing with the Arabs and dealing with the international situation, he said, I want to be able to make all the decisions. And so he was what they used to call him a democratic dictator. And again, that means that, he did insist on being elected. Once elected, he says, but you got to do it my way. And if you don't do it, I quit, or I resign, or I'll cry, or something like that. And by the late 50s, he had attained Hazaken, they call him the old man, and he had attained this authority. And Golda Meir was the foreign minister. We'll see, for the most part, not totally, she was a yes, I would say yes man, yes woman, No, she if he really cared, she went along with it. It's not 100% simple. The guy controlled the army. He was not only the Rotem Memshalah, the prime minister, he was Sar B'Tachon. He was the minister of defense. And he ran the whole thing under Shimon Peres. So whatever he said, they followed. He ran the FBI and the CIA out of his back pocket. He put one guy, Issa Harel, he's in charge of all the secret police, and he reported only Ben Gurion, not to the parliament, not to the public. You could keep secrets at that time in Israel, or at least he thought he could keep secrets, except he was dumb enough to trust this guy who turned out to be a KGB spy, and every night he dictated his diary to him. But, that just goes to show you how good the Russians are, and Ben Gurion thought he's so clever. In the years 57, 61, I call the Ben Gurion years, not much effort was made to attain peace with the Arabs. Okay? This is very much a Ben Gurionist policy. Much effort was expended internally to build up the state. And the reason is because, what are we going to talk to the Arabs about? First of all, they don't talk to us. But secondly, if they do, it's not even good. Because they're going to want land back, and they're going to bring refugees back. I don't want to do either of the two. So even though when he talks to Drew Pearson or Walter Cronkite, or people like so Israel wants peace for the following reasons, but that's baloney, right? No, they weren't doing anything in reality that would say, you give, we give, we'll do. He wanted to, you recognize me, and that's it. And the dirty little secret is that Ben Gurion and the Mapai state and the masses were quite comfortable with a state in which there were no Arabs. Okay? Whatever they said for the public, they kind of liked that old Israel of the late 50s. There were no Arabs in the country with whom the leftists could maintain a dialogue. And so the result was the left wing in the Ben Gurion years, such as we see today, the people, Peace Now and all the different similar groups, didn't exist or were radically marginalized. Martin Buber, the famous philosophy professor at the Hebrew U, he was the big person that represented the left. He had no influence in those years, right? He talked to his graduate students, you understand? But the overwhelming majority of the public was pretty doggone monolithic. This is what we call the Ben Gurion era. They were pretty monolithic on these kind of questions of peace and war and security and not talking to the Arabs. In other words, the Israelis, nobody liked the terrorism. But everybody liked the fact, there's a dirty secret, everybody liked the fact that there are no Arabs here, right? If you lived in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, there weren't any Arabs there because they were over the border. Now, there were Arabs in Israel, they were on the reservation. The dirty secret is that at that time they still had them under what they call military administration, which means that they had to live in their towns and weren't allowed out, except with a special pass, which they couldn't get usually. So that means like this. So I'm Jewish, I live in Tel Aviv. I'm Jewish, I live in Jerusalem. I'm Jewish, I live in Netanya, Beersheba. There's no Arabs. The army doesn't let them move in. You follow? They like that. It's not politically correct. It's not multicultural and so forth, which is true, and it isn't. They liked it. Okay? It's a chance to build a pure Jewish state, as they saw it. No Filipinos, no Romanians, no Polish, all these workers that are coming in now and living in different neighborhoods, and the crime, and the African immigrants. They didn't have any of that. You get it? It's only Jews. Now, they had demonstration between one side of Jews and the other, but that's a different story, right? Because this is unzera, as you say. It's not a high standard of living in those days. It was all Jewish. There's no intermarriage in the late 50s. There's nobody there who's not Jewish. You get it? There's no churches. Nobody's moving into we forget this. This is the Israel of once upon a time. There wasn't a Mormon movement. They didn't own the whole city of Jerusalem, so there's a cosmopolitan center, and that hundreds of thousands of people of different faiths and cultures come. Nobody came to Israel at that time. A few people, some Jews, a couple of occasional, Jerry Falwell types and things like that. It wasn't a big population. You didn't get to see many people that are not like you. It's famous. This old kind of funny traditional. He ran a funny state. Is really exemplified in a story. I don't know if I've told it before, with Isaac Deutscher, who was a famous Marxist intellectual in England, originally Polish Jew. Like all these a big communist, Trotskyite. He was the biographer of Trotsky, and of Stalin too. And he's from a Hasidic family. At a young age, somebody got to him and he said, "Eat this ham sandwich on Yom Kippur and God will not strike you." He said, "I don't believe it." And he ate it, didn't get struck. He said, "Forget it," So this is true. And so it became a big thing, and he wrote a book called The Non-Jewish Jew, and it's very famous. He visits Israel during the Ben Gurion time like this, and it's a very interesting article. And he used to publish in the London Times and places like that. And he goes to kibbutz Ein Charod, among other places. That's the left-wing Mapam kibbutz. Woo, doesn't get more left than that, okay? And very secular and all this sort of thing. But it's the Ben Gurion era. So this is the Mapam. It's not even the Mapai. And he's well-known Marxist intellectual, and therefore they want to, the Mapam is Marxist, they want to show him off. They say, we have a kibbutz, that's the real, everybody owns everything, it's collective ownership, and we have centralized leadership. We have a mazkirut, which is elected, but then it's democratic centralism. Everybody has to go on what the central committee says, and it's all planned, and it's Marxist. And he said like this, he said, "Why don't you grow pigs?" Then he said like this, the guy said, the mazkir, the head of he says, "It's not really economical," and so on and so forth. "No, I can prove to you from figures and economic statistics, it better to go chazer. You understand? You make more money this." And the guy said, nah, and it goes on back and forth, back. And finally, the Secretary General, the mazkir, Kali of the kibbutz, he writes, he says, loses his temper and bangs the table. And he said, "Damn it, we didn't come to Eretz Yisrael to grow pigs." You understand? Which means that at that time, even the ones who are militantly, this guy doesn't fast Yom Kippur. This guy, obviously, Shabbos, Kasher, things like this are not on the agenda. These are militant secularists. And yet, right, it's all Jewish environment, and they still have a lot of that stuff in there. And Jews don't eat chazer, Chas v'sholom, don't keep kosher, but you don't eat meat. Okay, so it was that kind of an era. Now, what exactly Jewish means? That was big fights. That's always big fights. I mean, Ben Gurion and Chazon Ish did not exactly agree on what the definition of Jewish is. You understand? No, but that's an in-house battle. Get it? That's a sufficient uns. You follow? It's an altogether different kind of conversation. Correct? It's altogether. Matter of fact, when Ben Gurion got there to Chazon Ish, they talked Ivrit. They talked Yiddish. So you have to understand. It was that kind of an era, which would not really be the case. That I doubt strongly. To give you an example, if Bibi Netanyahu can speak Yiddish. I don't think so. This was very much, the Israel I'm describing, with its very great insularity, its lack of outsiders, its small opportunities for intermarriage, was very much to the liking of people like the Ponevezher Rav and the Kloisenberger Rebbe, who made Aliyah in 1957 and was met at the airport by Ben Gurion. They were surprised about that. I have to tell you, I was a couple years ago in the Negev, and I stopped in State Boker, which is the Ben Gurion place, and you go to the, the museum that they have over there where his house was, or the kibbutz, and it's old, it's out of date, so they still have big black and white pictures, it looks like something from the 60s or whatever, and they have pictures of Ben Gurion with big leaders. It's huge, it's Ben Gurion and Churchill, Ben Gurion and de Gaulle, Ben Gurion and Eisenhower, Ben Gurion and the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Because but the point is that although they didn't like, this side and that side, they like the fact it's all Jewish. It's the Israel of old. Now, the media in those days, controlled by the government or right wing. That's the way it goes. The overwhelming majority of the newspapers and actually Ben Gurion himself personally appointed the Walter Cronkite, the guy who speak on the radio. So notice the Kol Yisrael belonged to the government. They didn't have a law at that time that it's an independent kind of an entity. You understand? And the Mapai party itself, there was no Amir Haas in the left-wing journalism, pro-Arab journalism in the Israel of that era. There was like one newspaper, Uri of Ner, which was very marginalized. There were like 20 or 30 big newspapers in Israel at that time. Once upon a time, each party had a big paper. Most of these have gone out of business. and the Mapai owned a lot of them. I'll just give you an example. People didn't notice. Jerusalem Post was owned by the Mapai Party for many years, okay, and later on by the Labor Party. Yes, it looks like an objective paper. It was owned by Ben Gurion, and Davar and all kind of other papers, and the regular papers like Ma'ariv and Yediot Achrono were founded by Jabotinskyites, by right-wingers. So there's a powerful consensus of this kind of policy of which, the heck with the Arabs, we don't want to deal with them, we don't want to talk to them in any kind of real way other than to simply take advantage of the fact that since the Arab propaganda constantly says that Israel is not legitimate and they have no rights whatsoever what to live, this is great, so we can always say like this, no, talk to us, because they know they won't. Talk to us, recognize us, let's be like human beings. If God forbid they would ever say yes, they wouldn't know what to do. This is what historians mean when they refer today to the Ben Gurionist state. It had these characteristics, and especially in the late 50s. Now, the problem is, and was, and remains today, how do you consolidate with these impossible borders? This is just an objective problem, isn't it? I mean, look at this. If you had the Russian army or the Chinese army, maybe. If you have millions of men to put over here, Israel doesn't have like that. They didn't then, and they don't today, and they had a lot smaller population then. So it was literally not possible to attain security when you have such terrible borders, which is a mistake Ben Gurion made in 48 and 49. I've talked about that in the past. It just is what it is. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the Sinai campaign, which is what we're talking about, the late 50s, Israel was safe from state actors. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? Nowadays, you have ISIS, you have Al-Qaeda, you have all kind of groups that they're not part of any state, and they just go and shoot and blow up, and what do you do to them? Right? The whole world is struggling right now to figure out what to do with this problem, and there is no solution. Get it? Obama or anybody else does not have any solution how to get rid, for example, of ISIS. They talk, I mean, we know this. That's quite a statement I'm making over here. It's not that there's a plan, but it's a difficult plan to implement. No one has a plan. They don't even know how to do it. In those good old days of the 50s, there was no such thing. There were countries, state actors as we call them. And a country has a certain responsibility. They hit you, you can hit them back. And in the late 50s, Israel was seen by them as stronger. So for example, the longest border, we can go back to the other one, it doesn't matter. The longest border is Jordan. Jordan is very weak. Israel loved that. You understand? King Hussein and Jordan at that time, he's constantly struggling, especially in the mid-50s, just to hold on. He didn't have any opportunity to build up a large army, attack Israel. He's not crazy, right? So that's good for Israel. Egypt was just beaten badly in the Sinai campaign. And Nasser considered himself lucky, whatever he said in public, that he got his land back. He's not in a mood to go make a war with Israel for what? They're going to win? Lebanon is always very weak. Thank God. Syria is a problem, right? Always was and still is. Syria was a big problem. I'll talk about that in a moment. But in those good old days, state actors were viewed as responsible for terrorism carried out from their borders. So this is a plus for Israel. If anybody comes in from Lebanon, Lebanon knows Israel going to hit them back. And they'll be entitled to. If anybody comes in from Jordan, same thing. This causes those countries in those days, not today, this country in those days to use their own police not to allow anybody across the border. Because you go into Israel to cause them to bomb us or something. So this was a big factor helping Israeli security. Now we'll see, it wasn't perfect at all. But helping Israeli security, trying to hold on to these borders. It was very difficult. The other very important factor to remember in those days, the Arab states were very hostile to one another. Nasser of Egypt, that's good to know, was the charismatic person. King Hussein of Jordan, Nasser is always trying to kill him. Many times in the 50s and 60s, the Mossad found out about it and told King Hussein, which is one of the reasons they've always been secretly friendly to Israel. The best one I remember is Israel warned them, he said, don't use your nose drops. I don't know how they found it out. No, well, I would tell you something. He didn't believe it. He was going to go like this, he put it in, it made a hole through acid. It made a hole through the sink. Right? If Israel didn't tell him, forget it, baby, right? This is it. In fact, King Hussein wrote a book around 1962, something like that, when he was still young, but politics had aged him. I remember it's called Uneasy Lies Ahead. Yes, it probably cost 12 cents on the book fair. And he says himself, one time he flew a plane, and the Syrians tried to shoot him down. And Israel came up there with the thing, and because of that, they didn't shoot him down. Okay? So the Arab states are very hostile to each other. Nasser, as well, and I'll talk about this more fully later on, was riding high. There were chances in the late 50s, because of his charisma, that he would be accepted as the leader of all the Arab world and cause one great nation. If you took a poll among the Arabs in the late 50s, they would say like this: let's join up with Egypt, get rid of our government, and make one big government. You understand? He had that kind of power. But the local governments fought back against it. All this means that they're not going to hook up together to go against Israel because they're really fighting each other. That was good. But Nasser was the big fear, because it's always potential that he can capture he had captured the imagination of the Arabs, and he was a charismatic figure. Many of you may have been here last year. He stood for the little guy, which the Arabs never get. He stood for progress, meaning that they shouldn't turn the women into 12th class citizens. You understand? He did. You know, he stood for what shall I say, certain socialism as he saw it, which will lift up the little guy. It didn't work, but, you know, little guy. And the fact that there was somebody who actually cared about them touched the Arab masses all over the Middle East, and I don't blame him. So this was very scary for Israel. And finally, in the late 50s, Nasser, teamed up with some other famous world leaders to call what they call the non-aligned bloc. Okay? Egypt is a big country. Yugoslavia at that time was a hush of a country. And India is big. And so the three together, they said, we're not in the Cold War, we're not siding with America, we're not siding with Russia. And oh my goodness, this went over real well with the intellectuals in the West, you know, the decadent guys in Europe and all the rest of it. This is a third way, meaning he was seen as representing a fresh new set of ideas. He took Egypt to the zenith of world opinion in a way that it isn't today at all. And this was scary to Israel. I mean, the guy could be a threat. Now, fortunately, it was all smoke and mirrors. It was a big lie. It was a bluff. And oh, thank God, you know. But they didn't know it at that time. And when he got together, as he did many times in the year, with Nero and Tito and Sukarno of Indonesia, if anybody remembers these names from the past, these are people whose aggregate is 1 billion people. And they're on his side. You understand? Ben Gurion would love, you know, he'll never get to anything like that. And so Nasser was a real threat. You can't understand the late 50s and early 60s without understanding the Israelis were sweating bullets over Nasser. Okay? Not over King Hussein, not over the prime minister of Lebanon. Nobody knows who that was. The Iraqis at that time were very far away and having their own problems. They went through revolutions and civil wars and things like that. I guess they still are, but you know, at that time it was very bloody. I guess it still is. But you know, so they were not a factor. But Egypt is a big factor, and Egypt is a problem, as we'll see. Now, specifically, the years 57, 61 were among the more quiet years as far as border infiltration is concerned. And that's why many Israelis look back upon this as a golden age. You understand? But it's not really true. It's just in relative terms. Do not think, I mean, it's not possible to seal off these kinds of borders. They don't have enough army to do it. You get what I'm saying? If an Arab wants to go and cross over from Nablus and walk it somewhere in the area of Tel Aviv, I mean, how are you really going to stop him unless you just get lucky and run into an Israeli patrol? But it doesn't happen like that. And so how could you do it? Take a look at this. These are a list of just, I mean, go down the names and you'll see. The guys in April of 57, they killed 2 guards at this kibbutz, and the gunman opened fire over here, and this guy was killed by a single sniper wound, and the militants did, you know, stuff happened, okay, as you can see. Having said that, it was by the standards of Israel, and by the standards of the Middle East, I'm sorry to say, this was good. Because before it was a lot more, okay? And the way the Israelis saw it was that this is the price of doing business. It's the price of living here. And a Ben Gurionist approach would be, so they're like bees, you know, giving us stings. Meanwhile, we bring in thousands of immigrants. You get it? We're consolidating our position. And one day we'll get so big that this won't matter anymore. That's how he saw it, and that's how the Israeli public took it. The United Nations was supposed to be in charge of the borders, but as you know, they didn't do a great job then, they didn't do a great job now. Both of these guys, General Burns and General von Horn, wrote books. Again, you can go to the library or get it for 50 cents online, if that. And they're very interesting because they deal with all kind of cross-border incidents. And by the way, Israel initiated plenty on their own. They're not all innocent. And he talks about all that. And to be perfectly honest, when you see an Arab attack, usually it's preceded by some kind of Israeli thing also. But nevertheless, in relative terms, it was a smaller number and less frequent and less noticeable than in other years. As I said, the real policy of Israel was the following, right? Bring in the numbers. Now, these are not huge numbers, but they're not tiny either. In 57, they brought 70,000. That's a lot. And in 61, this is from Morocco, which I'll talk about later on, they brought almost 50,000. 20 is whatever, it's moderate. Notice that the country did have a continuing immigration, but it wasn't what Ben Gurion wanted. He was very, frustrated by this. Here, let's go to the next chart, which Howard made. You see the idea. This is big, and this is moderately so. Now, Ben Gurion was so desperate that he always made speeches during this time. He came to America all the time, wants a big American aliyah. We need 1 million Jews, 6 million Jews to move from America in the West to Israel. So, fat chance. And it was very frustrating to him because this was the plan. Look, they lost the 6 million to Hitler. That was supposed to be where the numbers come. They lost that. So where's it going to come from? So Ben Gurion just looked from a very, pragmatic, cold point of view. You got 3 million Jews in Russia, 5 million Jews in America, but they couldn't come. The 3 million Jews in Russia can't come. The 5 million Jews in America won't come. Okay? Why don't you want to come? It's a wonderful country. It's run on socialist principles. That's why they don't want to come. What about the socialist Jews in America? They'd rather be socialist Jews in America. Rather send money to the Histadrut, That was the reality of it. Another big feature of the Ben Gurion years, prioritized the military. They spent a lot of money on the military because they figured they had to, okay? And so here's Ben Gurion with the generals. He always liked to take photographs among the troops. And it's a militarized state. Now, that doesn't mean that they lost their civilian virtues, but Israel was very much a militarized state. And the reason is, look at those borders. What's the choice? On the contrary, you had to inculcate the idea of the citizen soldier, in which on the one hand, he's ready to shoot, and the other hand, he's ready, to be a farmer or a teacher or something like that. So Israel assumed, especially in these years, they already had, but it became intensified these years, this very funny posture of a narrow state with a big military. You get it? It's like a small child with a big head. A narrow state with a big military, way out of proportion to other states its size. But he said that's the price of doing business. In fact, he pushed, and this was the era of the idolizing of the military. No question about it. Everybody wants to be a soldier. All the girls want to go out with soldiers. It's not simply like in America at that time, you got drafted, you got to put in your service, then you get your discharge, you get a job. Wasn't like that at all. Of course, there's going to be like that to some degree, but the notion is, it's defending the state, it's the new Jew, Ben Gurion called it Kodesh HaKadoshim, you understand? And it really was in there. After the Sinai campaign, Israel examined what happened. They saw it made a lot of mistakes. That's what happens in every war. Nothing wrong with that. No war with a lot of mistakes. And to their credit, they said, we got to fix this stuff up. And so, despite the propaganda, the Israeli Air Force did lousy in the Sinai campaign. And despite the propaganda, the Israeli tanks did lousy in the Sinai campaign. It's this, you got to remember that England and France also attacked Egypt, so that's why the Israelis won. And so the result is that in the late 50s, they put a lot of time into developing an excellent Air Force. That's when it really happened. And General Talkovsky, who's not well known today, was the guy who he was from a rich family in Haifa. He's the one who made the modern Israeli Air Force with his deputy, Ezer Weitzman, who I know everybody's heard of, and who's a relative of the Elbaums over here. And just to show you what I'm talking about, it's very famous. In 1959, Ezer Weitzman was in charge of the Air Force program, and all the pilots flunked out. One graduated. He said, we'll do one. So he had the whole parade, the graduation, all the rest of it, for one. And he was sending a message. Okay? Now, in the Ben Gurion theory, you could do this. Nowadays, this group would protest, and that one has psychological problems and all the rest of it. Those days, nobody could say anything. It was a totalitarian democracy. And Ezer White said like this, we want only A+, hatovim l'tayas, and anybody that can't cut the mustard, get out of here. You understand? If you can't make it through the program, then we don't want you. And did this make him look bad? No, man, look good. And I'm simply trying to show you that there was an emphasis on trying to upgrade the quality of the soldiers. Same thing happened with the tank corps during this time. This is the famous guy associated with it. This is General Ben Ari and Mordechai and Yisrael Tal. These are well-known names in Israel, especially Tal. They said, we don't want to repeat the screw-ups of the Sinai campaign. Israel doesn't really know what it's doing with the tanks. Let's start all over again from the bottom up. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, we have a variegated audience. If you're into this sort of thing, I would advise you to read a biography of General Tal, one of the ideas, in which he worked for 8 years before the 67 war. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, every a person in the tank corps has to learn all the jobs. In other words, you have to learn how to drive it, you have to learn how to shoot it, you have to learn how to do this, you have to learn that, in case anybody's wounded, the whole thing doesn't fall apart. In the Egyptian and the Russian army, there's a guy who's a tank shooter, there's a guy who's a tank commander. If somebody gets hurt, the whole thing falls apart. You get what I'm saying? They had to learn how to take a tank apart and put it together, meaning he put them through a real boot camp situation to upgrade the quality. And ever since then, Israel had, for 30 years, from 67 till recently, now tanks aren't what they used to be because they have the anti-tank weapons. But when the tanks were a big deal, Israel had one of the best. You get it? And this all happened in this peacetime, which is a peaceful period, but in Israel under Ben Gurion, there's no such thing as a peaceful period, which is civilian. Peaceful period means that the military is getting the main emphasis. In spite of everything I've just said, in the Middle East, things have a way of spinning out of control. Okay? And the big example of what I'm talking about is probably not known to anybody today, what they call the broom crisis of 59. What they call Konanut Rotem. Rotem is a broom. And I'll explain. And you'll see that many of the problems that I'm describing have not gone away in the year 2014. They've just become much more complicated. It all starts with the map. Here is the Israel-Syria map. Now let me talk about the fact that Syria and Israel have an unusual border, unlike the others. Very simply, Israel beat Egypt in 48, 49, and the Israeli army was already in Egypt and that caused the Egyptians to agree on a certain borderline, which they didn't want to agree on, but they did. And Israel could have even taken the Gaza Strip militarily, but Truman wouldn't let them. But it's clear that they won and beat Egypt. In Jordan, same thing. Egypt, by the end of, Israel in 48, 49, by the time you get to late 48, certainly 49, Jordan is beaten. It's just the UN and America won't let them take anything in the West Bank. And so Israel could force the Jordanians to adjust their borders here and there. We've spoken about that in the past. And there's no question who's the stronger one. Lebanon. Israel in late 48, in early 49, invaded Lebanon, who had invaded them, and got to the Litani River when the French and the UN forced a peace. And there's no question that Israel beat them. And they went back to the regular, normal border that had existed and still exists between Israel and Lebanon. But Syria was never beaten by Israel. People don't know this. The Syrians actually beat Israel. What do I mean when I say that? If you look closely at what happened in the 48 war, the Syrians invaded the Galil. They took over some territory, and Israel never got them out. Okay? Now, in April of 49, Israel wanted to fix that and say, okay, we're going to invade Syria and kick them the heck out of there. By that time, the UN and the State Department, everybody was already in such a position that they say, don't do that, instead negotiate with them. It's also true, if you recall this, that there was a coup in Damascus, and there was a new dictator that came in, and he was talking about making peace with Israel possibly, and because of a whole set of circumstances, the bottom line is that Tzahal never beat the Syrian army. And so when the peace armistice was signed by both sides and was a very difficult negotiations. The Syrians were not beaten. It's just that they pulled back to their side of the Palestine-Syria border, but with the areas that they had conquered in Israel being designated as demilitarized zones, DMZ, which is Israel's not supposed to occupy, it's supposed to be demilitarized, and the Syrians can do this, and the Israelis can do it. Very, very complicated. It's asking for trouble. That's what you see over here. Forget the Golan Heights. This is a map from a little bit later. This, what I'm pointing to now, is all part of Syria. But look at this. This is a demilitarized zone. Look at this. There's another demilitarized zone. Here's another one over here. Which means that the Israel-Syria border was not liked by either side, and each one started to make unilateral moves already in 49 to try to chop from the other side. So it was a problem that was never properly settled by one winning or the other, and until the 67 war, you might say. And the result is that all through the 50s, there was always trouble on the constantly always trouble on the Israel-Syrian border. They're infiltrating us, we are infiltrating them, and that's the way it went. Israel under Ben Gurion was always trying to do unilateral steps. He liked to call it uvdot, create facts. So for example, and it was not right, but he did it anyway. So for example, look where I'm pointing over here. This area, and not here, but here, there were Arabs living there. They had been, it wasn't their fault that the fighting was there, and ended up being in a demilitarized zone, which is, it never was 100% clear. Is this Israeli territory? Is it Syrian territory? Just the Syrians pulled out? Is it the UN? And in 51, early on Israel saying that Sahel made an operation, they kicked all the Arabs out of there, threw them into Syria. And Syria got very angry, who gave the right to do so. We did it. You see? So Syria said, oh, you want to do that? We'll do this. Israel, you do this, we'll do that. And you see what I'm talking about in terms of the tensions on the borders. Moreover, there's a crazy map here, and I'm going to call your attention to this, and I'm not doing to bore you, but all this matters a great deal, and we'll discover more about this once the war ends in Syria, if it does, the civil war, or some group takes over. I mean, you'll hear about the following. The borders in the Middle East currently were created by the guys who won the First World War. Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Woodrow Wilson, and Orlando, primarily the first three. They're the ones who drew up a country called Palestine, which never existed. They're the ones who made a modern state called Syria with their borders, Iraq, and so forth. We know this. Libya. The British took Palestine, what you and I today call Israel and Jordan. The French took Syria at that time, what you and I today call Syria and Lebanon. The British and the French were dealing with territory that had never existed before. So how do you draw a border? So the British and the French in the early 20s, once they were given this territory, they got together and they said, let's draw this amicably and come up with a line. That this part will be British, called Palestine, and this part will be French, called, say, Syria. And so they did, they had the negotiations. Syria has a number of rivers. Palestine does not have a lot of rivers, they had some, okay? And so the negotiators, on behalf of the British, said, listen, the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, this should belong all to the British, because they need the water. The Syrians, they have, partly the Euphrates River and the Tigris River going through the north, and other rivers over there. They have the Litani River in Lebanon. And the French, who for various reasons wanted to get a deal done, they agreed. And so when they drew the border between British Palestine and French Syria, they drew it. Now look very closely what I'm doing over here. And closely. They drew it in such a way. Now right here, the border runs right past the Kinneret. Meaning, it says over here, this is 10 meters. What's that, a yard or so, right? Which means all this, whatever. Yeah, wait a second. I thought it was, they said, wait a second. Syria is next to the river, next to the Kinneret. Syria has no access to the Kinneret. Get what I'm saying? This whole side is Israel, even when it's a few feet, 30 feet. He says, it doesn't matter, right? So if you're Syrian, this is infuriating, correct? It's our water like it's theirs. We're both what they call riparian states. We're both, geographically situated over here. And some crazy Meshuggah solution gave it all to them, and we can't. So I can walk up to 20, 30 feet, and I can't go past that? And Israel said yes. Now, if you're Syrian today, as well as yesterday, he's like, yes, who came up with this crazy idea? The British and the French? How's that mechayev us? You understand? That's not fair. And if I was a Syrian, I would say that too, correct? Because a couple of guys got together once upon a time over tea, or maybe with champagne, and they said, let's do the border here or there. It doesn't make any sense. And so Syria has always insisted until today, now right now they don't have a government, but they've always insisted until today that if there's ever a peace treaty, not only does Israel have to give back the Golan Heights, but they also give that 30 feet, right? Which of course has huge consequences, because then they take half the water and half this, and if Israel does something, they can complain. Meanwhile, Israel has the right in international law to say, yes, whatever we do in the Kinneret is our business, because no part of it touches any other Medina. It's completely ours. If you don't like it, the heck with you. Now, the Syrians then say like this, well, we have some water things that feed into the Kinneret. Israel say, you do that, we'll do this, right? And that is, by the way, is how the Six-Day War happened, when they had fights over that. But if you want to be legal and technical about it, the whole area of the Kinneret, which as you see faces Syria, I mean, we've all been into Tveria, you see across the way Syria, or the Golan now, was in such a way that the water is off limits to the Syrians. So this naturally led to a lot of shooting by one side over the other. The Syrians will send a fishing boat in, Badafka, the Israelis would sink it, the Syrians would shoot that Israeli boat, and a good time was had by all. So this is the way that the tension builds over here. In 1952 and 53, Israel started playing with the ecology, which again freaked the Syrians out. I mean, I'm going to show you what happened. Imagine if this didn't happen, this did not happen. Imagine if Israel said, we're going to drain all this and turn it into land. The Syrians would definitely freak out. Well, they did it to the Chula, to the other lake, not the big one, but the one up here, right? That there's a whole big body of water, like a little sea, not as big as the Kinneret, and Israel just drained it. So in other words, they changed the rules, right? And this was an ecological disaster, by the way. Israel made a big mistake. This was going by the science of the mid-century. Egypt made the same mistake with the Aswan Dam, today, if you read up on this, look at the Chula. Some of you may have been there. I was there a year or two ago with a friend of mine. It's very pretty. Israel has refilled the lake to a small degree. It's not what it was, but to some degree, and they need it for the ecology. It messed up. They by the standards of agronomy of the 50s, they thought they'll turn it into a fertile area, growing stuff. It didn't grow. And anyway, you don't play with swamps, I mean, I'm not a scientist and ecologist, all the rest of it, but I think we all know enough to know that you don't mess with Mother Nature that way. That was the time that they thought it could. Well, Syria freaked out naturally, and they said, who gave you the right to do this? Israel said, tough luck. And so you can just understand it was a poisoned atmosphere between Israel on the one side and Syria on the other hand, all through the 1950s. And that's why you have all these shootings, and the Israeli commander was Ariel Sharon. Let's go back just for 1 second to the previous map. Here's the Chula right up there, all the way to the top. So if you ever go to Israel, you want to go all the way to the top, right, to the finger at the top, near Metula, but on the Syrian side, then you'll see the Amek, the Chula Valley where it was. Now they've turned it into a bird preserve. You get what I'm saying? In other words, it's very pretty. I mean, I'll make a tourist pitch. I'm not doing this on my trip, but it's very worthwhile to go see it at this time of the year in the winter, because the birds come from all over the place and all the rest, and it goes to show you what Israel could do if they would just leave them alone. But it's right up against the border. You understand? It's in a very dangerous area, so to speak. Okay, now, having shared with you all these facts, let's get into the story. In the aftermath of the Sinai campaign, Nasser appeared to be the winner in the eyes of the Arab world. I just showed you the Israeli propaganda picture with Moshe Dayan strutting around and having the parade in Sharm el-Sheikh, all the rest of it. Nasser, if you saw his movies, the Israelis got the heck out of there, right? We forced them out. We defeated them. We crushed them, the Arab propaganda. And so in the Arab world, he was the great hero, and he still remains the great hero of 56. In fact, there was a big Egyptian movie a few years ago that was like a bestseller before the Mubarak uprising called Nasser in 56, right? And it's all about that. And, it glorifies his role. And I can understand from their point of view because he did win in the end, meaning he forced the invaders out. Now, his figure was riding very high in the Arab world. In Syria, meanwhile, there were a lot of coups going on, coup d'etats, followed by a democratic regime in 54, and you have a lot of regular political parties. It's hard for us to imagine today that Syria, once upon a time, was a democracy of a certain type. And when they had this, which party looked like it's gaining the strongest? The Communist Party, because Russia giving them endless money. So the CIA freaked out, Nasser freaked out, and the Syrian non-communists freaked out. And they say, what are we going to do about this rise of communism when we landowners and business owners and capitalists and small shopkeepers and things like this and religious people don't want the country to go communist. So the non-communist groups in Syria invite Nasser to come in, get rid of the Reds, and create a united Arab Republic. It's unique. They tell a guy from another country, come in and be our president, together with yours. Unity is anyway a keystone of the modern Arab nationalism, at least it was once upon a time. This will really be a wonderful unity thing, Egypt and Syria in a single country. We're going to call it the United Arab Republic, and we'll stick it to Lloyd George and the guys who made those false borders once upon a time, right? It'll be a triumph of Arab nationalism. Nasser agreed. He came to Cairo. There you go. You can't hear the thing, but you can see the pictures will say it all, right? Here is the formation of what they call the United Arab Republic in Cairo, and there's the flag of Egypt, the flag of Syria. Now they're going to be one country, and here's the president of Syria, and the president. Now he's saying like this, please take over my country, right? I'll be the vice president, you'll be the president. And it did happen, okay? So again, if you want to know more about it, just Google, United Arab Republic and whatever, and you'll see. And the masses, look at that, okay? And so the result is Israel went through conniption. They had a heart attack. Ben Gurion freaked out, because this is the nightmare. Egypt in the south, Syria in the north, a single country, united command. Oh my God, what's going to happen, right? He starts writing to all over the world. He wrote to Eisenhower and Dulles. He said, you have to help us. America has to give us weapons and make us a defense treaty, all the rest of it. Eisenhower, as I told you last time, who was no dummy at all, he said like this, like Obama, don't worry, we got your back. All right? And by the way, this was not Obama. This was General Eisenhower, the commander of D-Day. He had his back. But Eisenhower like this, he said, but I don't want to get involved more than necessary, and it's not necessary to go and advertise to the whole world that we're helping Israel. Just don't worry about it, right? Well, if worse comes to worse, we'll be there. That's not what Ben Gurion wanted to hear at all, okay? And it was really crazy. Now, what's really interesting is that Ben Gurion, by this time, had emerged from the Sinai campaign very conservative and cautious. He had been burned by the experience of the American pressure that forced him out, and he was also very chary now about endangering this fragile state of Israel. Now, he was not in the mood after the Sinai campaign to get in another war. It's not what you think. He had come out of the experience convinced Israel could never fight a war unless it had big allies like England and France, and we don't have them now in 1957. He had become convinced that retaliatory raids don't help anymore. This was the guy who fired Sharet and these other guys because they're always opposing his sending over retaliation raids under Ariel Sharon and others to blow up Arab villages. He doesn't do that anymore, you see? In fact, raids can lead to an escalating cycle of violence which can end in war, and he saw that war had gained Israel no land. So what's the point of the expenditure of blood and treasure? In other words, he came to see, although he will never ever say this, Moshe Sharet was kind of right, but he'll never say that. Okay? As a result, from 57 on, there were no retaliation raids. It's interesting. 1949, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, Israel was always sending these groups over, what they call Chet Shachor, the black arrow. And now 57, 58, 59, 60, almost none, right? Very rarely. And as I showed you, the Arabs attacked us. So as a result, it's kind of interesting. Here's Moshe Dayan quit at the beginning of 58. The new General Laskov was a Ben Gurion guy, very capable general, and keep the army on the rein, Don't do something that could lead to war, because what does Israel gain from a war? He didn't think they'll be able to keep on anything. On the other hand, the Syrians now feel very cocky. Nasser had their back. And they began shelling the Kinneret, because it's our territory, right, really? Israel fired back, and this went through all through 58. So this is a period, right? Israel has this. Again, I remind you, see this road? This is the Israeli road. This is Israel. The old border was up to here. This is modern times in Golan. But the Syrians were here. They were not allowed to go into here. And boy, it really bothered them. So they're mainly shooting here at Israeli settlements all along here. And it's very tense. In this increasingly tense situation that goes from 58 and into 59, on April Fool's Day, Israel experiences an Orson Welles moment. What do I mean when I say Orson Welles? The Martians. Everybody know what I'm talking about? Raise your hand if you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. All right, that's fine. No, they're not from America. That's fine. No. It's fine. Orson Welles, listen, I had an aunt who almost had a heart attack. Okay? In 1938, in the golden age of radio, before TV existed, so they had all the radio shows. So they had the Word of Worlds. So Orson Welles was this big, upcoming, young drama person, put together a whole thing on the radio. They say this, oh my God, the Martians have landed in New Jersey. They're coming into Newark. Oh, the army's stopping them. It's a death ray. Oh, this is terrible. That's what the guy's saying on the radio, right? They say, oh no, they're sending out a beam, and they're waving out thing. Oh, they're George Washington Bridge. They're coming into Manhattan and the Bronx. Well, if you listened a minute before the show, they said, we're now going to have a science fiction thing. But a lot of people didn't do that, right? You know, this is the old days. They went to the kitchen, they went to the bathroom, they didn't go, they weren't there for the thing beforehand. They turned on the thing too late, and now look at this. You're a 40, 50, 60-year-old person, so, you know, a 50-year-old lady, Jewish lady in the Bronx. It's go-go-mogog, you know? No, you hear the guy says, oh, they're coming up Fifth Avenue, and they're destroying the building. Oh, the Empire State Building being destroyed. And the guy says, like on the Hindenburg, oh, this is horrible to watch. I can't see the people burning alive. All these, you know, the ones who didn't know almost died. In fact, some people did. Like I say, I had an aunt that she just turned on the radio at the wrong time, and she like freaked out, you know, and so on. Well, Israel had an Orson Welles moment. What am I talking about over here? I couldn't make this up. He says, on April Fool's Day of all times, Kol Yisrael, you're in Israel, it's April 1st, there's only one radio station, Kol Yisrael. Kol Yisrael issues, they say like this, in 2 hours, 3 hours, Hoda'ah Chashuva Ma'od. There'll be a very important announcement. In Israel on Ben Gurion's time, that's a war. You know, something with the military. Okay? Then they say like this, all of a sudden, they start using code words, which is general mobilization. They use the 3 code words over here. This means this, ducks. This means this. This means this, right? So that's all you need. And they repeat it over and over again in 9 languages. In Hungarian, in Romanian, this a war. You get it? It's a war. Now, they announced beforehand, but people missed it. It's going to be a practice, right? But they put it in the back of some kind of dumb commercial, whatever. Nobody noticed that. And so the whole country's on freak out. And it is Israel, and it is the 50s, and this could happen, right? I mean, it's not nuts. So everybody drops what they're doing. I mean, it was a Marx moment, you know, the duck suit. Anyway, the public took it for the real thing. It's Arab invasion impending. It's immediate mobilization. It's war. The guy who has the ice cream truck runs to the mobilization center because they use the ice cream trucks and the garbage trucks not to transport soldiers to the front. I mean, that's it. In the Knesset, they're in the middle of a session, and they're shocked. They say, what's all this about? Hits them like a thunderbolt. Menachem Begin rises to the occasion. He immediately rushes up and he says, I guess, Israel's prepared for war. We back to Sinai, on to Cairo, this kind of stuff. He thought, you know, right? He says, if Sahal tells us to do this, we will say yes. You know, he made a whole speech like a fool, you know. They don't show this in the Begin biographies. Anyway. Meanwhile, Cairo freaks out. You understand? This is Nasser. They always say here. They're sending code words in 9 languages on the Kol Yisrael. Nasser said, whoa, what is this? Is this a surprise Israel attack? Is another sign, I think? What? There was not even a sign for what's going on. King Hussein, who's more scared, he says, you know, Jordan will meet its responsibilities to preserve his life. Like, everybody, okay? Now, Eisenhower finds out. freaks out. He calls Ben Gurion the line. What the hell is happening? That's what he said to him, That's how Ben Gurion finds out about it, because Ben Gurion didn't listen to the radio, Okay? So eventually, it took hours and hours, and meanwhile people, had heart attacks and things like this. It was announced it was a drill, okay? And it was announced it was a drill, and what can I tell you? The best part of the story is, well, I'll save that for later. Hold on, take it easy. He says, the best part of the story is, they fired a bunch of generals. In fact, Yoshafat Harkabi was a famous head of the military intelligence, and Ben Gurion said, you got to be fired. Harkabi said, wasn't my mistake, it was your mistake. He said, well, that's the way it goes, And then he said, you can't do that to me. Ben Gurion said, I won't do it to you. Go for a trip to England, and when you come back, we'll reinstate you. Of course, he went to England, he fired him, and didn't reinstate him. That's how Chaim Herzog became the head of the military intelligence. Look, it is what it is. I'll tell you what. I will tell the story. It's a little out of order. Ben Gurion heard about this on the radio after Eisenhower called him. And they wouldn't get a hold of the generals in charge. But the generals were at a concert in Tel Aviv, being given because the Queen of Belgium was visiting Israel. And at that time, royalty doesn't come to Israel. They'll even take Belgium, And so, in the 50s, And so Ben Gurion calls the theater, the opera house. And the usher picks up the phone and he says, Medaber Ben Gurion, I want to speak with so-and-so. He says, yeah, you're Ben Gurion and I'm Nasser. He hangs up. So he's real angry. He calls up again and says, this is Ben Gurion. I never tell the Kashim Ramat Kal with the chief of this. The guy said, oh, cut it out already, Goes like 3 times. Finally, the 4th time, this is Israel in the 50s. The 4th time, Ben Gurion calls up, starts cursing him in Yiddish. You know what I'm saying? The best of Paskonyak. And the guy says, oh, it is Ben Gurion. He said, I'll get you. Excuse me. He goes and gets the generals, and they had to call the whole thing up. And he has to tell Eisenhower it was a mistake. Now, years later, now I want to tell you something. We live now many years later. So when I looked at this, I found out years later, it turned out who was the one that really was responsible for the whole mess up. It was a deliberate thing. Hear me out. It was Ezer Weitzman. Wait a minute. He wanted to do a thing that would scare the Egyptians. They would send planes over Israel, and Israel wanted to test if their pilots could shoot down an Egyptian plane shooting over Israel. You get it? But he never told anybody for 20, 30 years. So all the people who got into trouble, and nobody ever found out. So that's how it goes. There's what I call the Yonadav rule from the Tanakh, from the book of Shmuel Beis. Yonadav is the one who gets Amnon in trouble, but nothing ever happens to Yonadav. So that's how it goes. By the way, Ben Gurion came to the Knesset the next day. He looked at Begin and said, you idiot. Oh, what a blockhead. Anyway, as a result of this, now in Israel they call this rubber ducky, Leil Habar Vazim, the night of the ducks, because that was the code word, right? One of the code words that they call everybody up over there. Which you have to understand, in Israel, it means every 5 minutes they repeat the code words. So it's not crazy that someone would think that this was a real war. As a result of this, the Israeli military establishment is wary of calling general mobilizations, and this would cause trouble months later. In December of 59 and January of 60, December 15 and 60, Syria shelled Israeli positions in Tel Katsir. In other words, they shot over here, around over here. It was a kibbutz. And they hit some people and buildings. For one reason or another, Israel decided this time we have to make a response. The Syrians did it with heavy mortars and things like this. And on January 31st, 1960, an Israeli policeman was killed and 2 were wounded. The same night, Israel sent the Golani Brigade in, what they call Operation Khargol, or Cricket, which raided Egyptian positions, and basically they blew up a Syrian town. Not Upper Tafik, but Lower Tafik. They blew up the whole town. So we're back to Ariel Sharon in the early 50s. 9 Syrians were killed, 15 were injured. Israel suffered 3 killed, and so on and so forth. Egypt the military raged a state of alert. They mobilized 2 brigades. They moved an artillery regiment in, a tank company. In other words, they took it very seriously. Now, this was the first retaliation raid since the Sinai campaign. And I guess Israel said enough is enough. Syria looked weak. Nasser was now the president of Syria. He was also president of Egypt, but he's president of Syria. His generals wanted to do something to show they weren't going to let Syria fall to the mercy of Israel. Now, really, it was a raid, but since it hadn't happened in a long time, they weren't sure. Maybe it's the beginning of Israeli invasion of Syria. Could be. The generals wanted to create pressure on Israel from the south so that Israel would hesitate to invade Syria. Do you follow that? So this was General Amr, who was the defense minister, the head of the military under Nasser. And he's pushing Nasser. He said, we got to do something to show that Egypt is there for our Syrian fellow compatriots. Okay? And so basically we should move the army into the Sinai desert. So a week after the Israeli attack, the Egyptian army crossed the Sinai and took up positions near the Negev. Do we have a map here? Okay. All right. That'll be good. So now I want to explain. Under the 49 armistice agreement, the bulk of I'll be more exact. Under the Sinai campaign conclusion agreement of 56, 57, the general idea was that this Egyptian army has to remain, most of it, on the other side of the Suez Canal, within Egypt proper. They can have a few, but not many troops in the Sinai desert. That's the rule today. Right? If you ever pay close attention to news, Egypt is not allowed to send in soldiers to fight the ISIS unless Israel gives them reshus on a temporary basis. So at that time, you had the same kind of rule, though Nasser didn't like it, and instead you had UN soldiers that are in the middle. But on this occasion, Nasser said, to heck with it, and they moved the Egyptian army over the Suez Canal into the Sinai desert, right up against it, right here. Right here. Okay? And the problem is that Israel had bad military intelligence. Ben Gurion was afraid to send planes over to Egypt because he didn't want to look like provocative after the 57 war and all the other trouble. And basically, Israel was surprised. They had no idea what was going on. The military intelligence in Israel stunk. Here, here. Chaim Herzog had been the guy who had replaced the fired guy in charge of military intelligence called the rubber ducky, right? And Rabbi said, we've been caught with our pants down. He said that. He said, well, he found out and he was shocked. Now, how did they find out? This is pretty sad what I'm going to tell you. Ben Gurion, of all people, had behaved overcautiously and had forbidden overflight in Sinai. Eisenhower, of all people, America had the U-2s. Does anybody remember that? They had spy planes that nobody knew about at that particular time. They found out later. They had spy planes going all over the world all the time and sending information to the CIA. Eisenhower knew that the Egyptian army has crossed into the Sinai. He was shocked that Israel didn't do anything about it. Eisenhower called Ben Gurion. He says, are you aware of what, because what are you talking about? He said, I would suggest, Eisenhower! He said, I would suggest you send a plane to fly They flew over, they saw the whole Egyptian armies crossing. Whoa! They went crazy, went back and Ben Gurion said, how did this happen? And Rabin said, we caught with our pants down. No, it's a disaster. You understand? The Israelis saw the whole army that was over there. They can break into Israel anytime. Do you understand? Let's go back to the map. There were no soldiers here. Israel wasn't mobilized, especially after that last disaster with the mobilization. They weren't mobilized. They had some soldiers facing Syria, but that's up here. Nobody was here. You get it? They had altogether 7,000, between here and here, 7,000 soldiers. It's nothing. As a matter of fact, the Arabs couldn't have dreamed up a better scenario. And this is Ben Gurion, who's supposed to be Mr. Military, Mr. Security. This is Laskov and Diana. How could this happen? It happened. This is what they call Conan the Rotem, the broom operation. They could bust into Israel any time and not be stopped. Laskov orders immediate general mobilization. Ben Gurion says no. And he was the kind of defense minister, he said, like, I'm the boss, and I say no. I don't want to know any more duckies, as he said. No more Barfazim. So Israel finds itself at the mercy of the Egyptian army in February of 1960. It's unbelievable. This, my friends, is a foretaste of the Yom Kippur War of a few years later. True? Right? Israel, with all of its power and all of everything, got caught, as he said, no. The only difference is, this is 1960, the Ben-Gurion era. Their censorship prevents the media from reporting the heightened state of alert, and Ben-Gurion meets with the newspaper editors and tells them what they should not report. And you could do it at that time. They had what they call the Editors' Commission. Do you understand what I'm saying? Ben-Gurion met with the guy of Haaretz and Mariv, Yediot, and Jerusalem Post, and Davar, and this and that and the other. And he says, listen, the Egyptian army's over there. Don't say a word and make panic. Okay, don't say anything. He tries, of all people, Ben-Gurion, diplomacy. He goes, he talks to the UN. Dag Hammarskjöld was the Secretary General of the United Nations. Hammarskjöld said like this: is it Israel that's threatening Egypt, or is it Egypt threatening Israel? It's Egypt that's threatening Israel. We will not interfere. That's a nice guy, right? So much for the big peacekeepers. This is not something we want to get involved in. What's going to happen over here? Eisenhower, Kedarko, secretly calls Nasser, and he said like this. He says, just move back. Do you really want a war? This is not for the public, just between you and me. Do you really want to think it through? Okay, are you ready for this? I understand a funny situation has happened. I get the temptation, all the rest of it. But as a general, I'm asking you, are you ready for all the consequence over here? Now, this is not Obama talking. This was General Eisenhower. You know, he had a big prestige. You understand? And he said, when it comes to war, it's not just about day one. It's about day 2, 3, 4, and 5. Have you thought this through? Meanwhile, Khrushchev, the head of Russia, calls up Nasser, go for it, baby. Why not? That's the Russians, okay? In the end, Nasser has a healthy fear of the Sahel. It's a trap. After all, this is the Middle East, is it not? The headquarters of the conspiracy theories. It couldn't be that the country of Ben-Gurion and Dayan left themselves open. This is clearly, you understand? Because in the Middle East, 1 + 1 never equals 2. And if it does, why? And so remarkably, Israel, this is a heck of a story. Israel stays there naked. And more remarkably, Nasser, after 2 weeks, starts pulling his men out. And little by little, took him about 2, 3 weeks, and Eisenhower was watching it, with the planes. Little by little, they pulled everybody back on the other side of the Suez Canal, and a war therefore did not happen. Okay? Why? Neither leader really wanted war. It was that simple. Correct? It was a set of flubs, People made a lot of mistakes. It wasn't part of a plan. Nasser wanted to make sure Israel wouldn't threaten Syria. And in this, he succeeded. Ben-Gurion, likewise, had no desire to engage in war. Why would he? What are he going to gain from it? Because both were strong national leaders with authority over their national security elites. They could back off without loss of faith. They could do it. What is striking about this affair, which is called, as I say, Rotem, the broom affair, the Rotem affair, in English, and in Hebrew, it serves as a what? Does anybody see where I'm going? This is a dress rehearsal, my friends, for the crisis of 67, which indeed erupted into the Six-Day War, even though no side wanted war then either. But it was a different set of characters. In 67, you didn't have Ben-Gurion, you had Eshkol, who was not self-confident. You didn't have Laskov, you had Rabin, who was not self-confident. They didn't say, let's calm everything down, pull everybody back. It's also true that in 67, Nasser made a couple of speeches which were dumb and got all the masses, we remember this, many of us, they got the masses all heated up, and next thing you know, he painted himself into a corner. He didn't do as he was in 1960, where the only person he talked to was Eisenhower, secretly. Then you're talking like a mensch. Instead, he starts saying, we're ready to take back Israel, the ultimate liberation. Well, in the Arab world, you can always start a mob. That's easy at the drop of a hat. Can you pull a mob back once you started it? You see? And so in the 67 war, Nasser was much more of a prisoner due to his own fault of the Arab street. And we know the Arab street. Look at them today in Cairo. This is taken from 2014. All right? You know what they call this? Wednesday. Now, Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister in 67, wanted to do a Ben-Gurion. He didn't have that kind of charismatic authority. The generals wouldn't listen to him. Ben-Gurion was against the Six-Day War. If you know, I'll save that, hopefully some future occasion. If it was up to him, it wouldn't have happened. because Ben Gurion said he would never believe that Israel could hold on to what they had. And if they did, and finally, LBJ was not Eisenhower. Right? He didn't have that kind of gravitas, and he didn't have that kind of authority. As Eisenhower was older, Johnson was already stuck in the Vietnam War, and internationally he did not have a high profile. Eisenhower was Eisenhower, right? And so when he said, "I got your back," in reality, he really did. You understand? He really did. And I would also, so let me put it this way. In conclusion, even during the relatively quiet period of 1957 to 61, Israel could not enjoy total security from infiltration and terrorism. The impossible 1949 borders continue then, as they do now, to be so porous as to positively invite attack. And this was before the Palestinians, this is before the PLO. At the time I'm talking about, Arafat didn't exist, so to speak, you understand? Which only made things a lot worse. So you had state actors, and even then, it was far from perfect. The plain reality is that there was, and there is, no way to hermetically seal off those borders if Israel ever goes to them. The most that could be done was to lower the number of infiltrations. That's why this guy has a tough job. Right? You can dump on him and all the rest of it, but he's got a tough job. What are your cards, as it were? I conclude with the famous words of my favorite Democrat. True or not true? Good night.